We're just giving it a few more minutes because of the communion, and people are just getting out. Good morning, everyone. Am I too loud? Welcome, welcome, welcome to February, Black History Month. And the Adult Faith Formation has decided that this year we will be looking at the sacred art of Black preaching. We will learn about the unique Black sermonette traditions of preaching through the instructions of Black local pastors and preachers throughout the greater Denver metro area. The Black sermonette tradition is an approach to homiletic construction and delivery practice primarily among African Americans in the Black church. The tradition seeks to preach messages that appeals to both the intellect and the emotive dimensions of humanity. The tradition finds its roots in the painful experience of Blacks during the period of slavery in America, as well as experience during the Jim and Jane Crow era. You know, most of you say Jim Crow, but you know, Jane was also involved. Subsequent discrimination and what's going on in our life today in the Black community. I can say a whole lot more about that, but I know that our guest has his own church, and he preaches today at his church. The Reverend Dr. Eugene Downing is the pastor of the New Hope Baptist Church in Denver. Prior to joining New Hope in 2011, he served as pastor of the 6th Mount Zion Baptist Church of Pittsburgh for 11 years. In addition to his role as New Hope, Dr. Downing has served in various capacities at the Gathering Place, Denver Public Schools, Habitat for Humanity, American Baptist Churches, the Denver Museum of Science and Nature, State of Colorado Energy Office, and morning devotions with the Colorado State Senate. Dr. Downing holds a master's degree in divinity from the Samuel DeWitt Proctor School of Theology in Virginia, Union University, and he's completed his doctoral ministry degree at the Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. He has a wonderful wife, Nichelle, she's here today, supporting him. And he's done missionary work in both Haiti and in Mexico. He's the author of the book, Navigating Life with God. Let us welcome the Reverend Dr. Eugene Downing, the New Hope Baptist Church. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's very gracious of you all. It's a delight to be here, and kind expression of thoughtfulness to show up to a lecture on a snowy, icy Sunday morning, so God bless your heart. We're glad to be here, thankful to be with the great people of Montview, a blessing to be among my colleagues in Ian and Clover and Dr. Newton. I'm thankful to have my wife with me this morning and looking forward to this conversation. I want to thank Josh and the media folks for getting me all connected here. And a blessing to see my good friend Jim Cummings, a fellow New Jerseyan here. So I'm in good company, amen, and his wife. Pleasure to see you both. And so I want to take some time this morning to talk about this wonderful thing called the sacred art of African American preaching. And I understand that we sort of hold for questions at the end, but as you'll see, I'm a little more dialogue-centered. So if you want to raise a question, have a thought to share, please feel free to raise your hand and we'll engage as we go, all right? Okay, so I want to do a little historical background and provide a little context to talk about this really wonderful subject known as African American preaching. African American preaching originates in the continent of Africa. And on these shores, the best example we have of a beginning would be in what were called the hush arbors. Yeah, I'm in between like near side and far side here. In between in the hush arbors, amen. And the hush arbors were these distant spaces at the edges of plantations during enslavement. They were grassy knolls. They were literal brush-filled places. They were areas that were covered over by grass, by leafy trees, by long, wide bushes, where people of African descent, we gathered to celebrate God in our own way. The significance of this historical fact is that it was in those gatherings that people of African descent that we developed not only a style of preaching, but more so were able to take and reshape the theology that was shared with us in plantation religion. That is that as people of African descent, we brought religion with us, and yet encountered a religion, as you can imagine, that was much more designed to maintain plantation life. And so while people of African descent, we would gather in the quote-unquote plantation church service, and that service ended somewhere at the nightfall. We would gather at the brush arbors, the hush arbors, the riversides, as it was said, and in those spaces and places cultivate an understanding of who God is, cultivate our own idea of how to share the gospel in ways that liberated our souls from the condition we were enduring through enslavement. Thus you have this saying, the hush arbors. This author I found says that in those spaces we adapted doctrines we made for their own spiritual needs with a clever coding of plans from their masters and unified faith to find the legacy and significance of brush arbor meetings, meaning that we would take that which was given to us in terms of what we would call today proof texting, what we would call sort of a religious perspective, a biblical perspective, quite frankly, that was skewed, and mine out of that the faith that we brought with us, knowing who God is in us, going sort of back to that book of Genesis that we're made in the image of God. And so it was very difficult, as you can imagine, to be on a plantation and see yourself as made in the image of God in the religious guise, if you will, of those who were oppressing and enslaving you. So the hush arbors became that space where we could carve out our own understanding of God and celebrate God in ways that were liberating. All right. From there, this idea of hush arbor theology, which I think I just explained, is talked about by Gaylord Wilmore, James Cone, who are, I'm sure some of you have heard of James Cone, who are well known for their works around these ideals, but more than that, the idea of African American theology and preaching and sacred life. Wonderful authors to look into for further background. And then you have hush arbor preachers, right? Sojourner Truth was one. Jarena Lee was another. Sojourner Truth, one of her famous lectures was given around 1920, a little earlier than that probably, called Ain't I a Woman, as she talked about her own womanhood if in a gathering of feminist women who were describing their own womanhood, and Sojourner Truth stood to talk about womanhood from her own life experience and perspective. That link's not live right now, so I'll have to get to it later. However, these two extraordinary women represented the beginning of liberation preaching, I would call it, hush arbor preaching for sure, and presenting the gospel in ways that allowed men and women to find God in themselves and see themselves as God's creation, even though enslaved, even though on plantations, serving as chattel property. And so the deep value of understanding the art of African American preaching, the sacred art, as you've titled it so well, I think begins there, right? This idea that long before a sanctuary, long before a denomination, that people of African descent gathered and searched their hearts for the understanding of God to be able to declare the gospel in ways that would yet liberate them, even though in chains. Any questions? I'll pause. Yeah, please. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, wonderful question. The question was there a conflict between the gospel they were receiving and what they were learning in the hush arbors, if you will? Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, so there are researchers who have written about this very dichotomy, right? The idea that the gospel was not in a sense it was. It was contrived in ways to maintain, the order of the plantation, right? And lest I get political, we can trace some of that even today, right? I mean, that's not the conversation today. However, if we look, if we look around our world, right, at the way that some of us who follow the faith are suggesting we might vote in the upcoming election, you can sort of trace the fact that in some ways the gospel is still being sort of, shifted, shaped, and changed in ways to fit an agenda, a purpose, an outcome. And yeah, your question, absolutely. So there were huge conflicts, and those conflicts are what birthed what carried over out of enslavement into the early 1900s slave laws, particularly in the southern United States, that forbade African American congregations from gathering with an African American pastor. Absolutely. Even here in Colorado. So the first African American church in Colorado formed is Zion Baptist Church. But for the first several years of its founding, it could not gather with an African American pastor. Yeah, to your question, right? So there was this hope to hold on to this dichotomy and thereby sort of maintain this slave mentality even long after enslavement was over. And so really wonderful question. And I think that question underscores the power of these hush arbor experiences that allow people of African descent to still find God in the midst of all of this going on. Yeah, thank you. Other questions, anybody? All right. And beyond Sojourner Truth and Jarena Lee, when you move beyond that era, if you will, the next era would be what we call antebellum, right? As we know to be just beyond emancipation, so 1865 and beyond. And these antebellum preachers brought to mind for me Luke 4:18, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he's anointed me to proclaim the good news to the poor, freedom for the prisoners, recovery of sight to the blind, and set the oppressed free. So it's in this space from the hush arbor to antebellum era where liberation theology and the quote-unquote social gospel began to take greater shape in the life of African-American religion and African-American Christians, etc. And as is written and documented both in song and in word. And I'm sure you all have had I'm almost certain that you all have had the Spirituals Project here at Montview, and you've heard their powerful interpretations of the gospel in song. And so the spirituals, as you listen to them, they indeed tell the stories of enslaved Africans seeking this sort of liberation understanding. Go down, Moses, let my people go, is literally a song written about enslaved Africans searching for freedom, right? Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Oh yeah, a great song, but also was a signal, hey, we're leaving tomorrow. So these were literal, right? Yeah, going back to your question, right? So people of African descent, we take these very traditional, customary, religious symbols and icons and find liberation in them, and find ways to not only survive, but to thrive spiritually in what was a very challenging and demanding atmosphere. And so as a result, this sort of liberation theology and social gospel evolved around Moses and the prophets, understanding the whole idea of escaping Egypt and running from Pharaoh and finding freedom across the Red Sea, and of course the prophets who spoke boldly about justice and about the love of God and about God redeeming those who are oppressed. And then this whole idea of Jesus and the disinherited, which is not necessarily an antebellum preaching phraseology, comes much later on, but in a sense evolved from that period. And these preachers are some of those who were well-known antebellum preachers. Hiram Revels, who became a U.S. senator, actually, in Mississippi. Denmark Vesey, who was the founder of Mother Bethel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina, where the horrific incident took place. Extraordinary story, if you ever get the time to look into Denmark Vesey, that the church that he founded there not only was an AME church, but an abolition-centered church that took intention around challenging enslavement in the South, around challenging oppression in general in the South, as we know that enslavement technically ended at emancipation, but slave laws and justice in general for the community of African peoples was very much a dismal sort of life. And Denmark Vesey and the Mother Bethel AME Church were very much a part of liberation that time. Absalom Jones and Richard Allen both were Methodists by, I guess you call that, what do they call it in the Methodists? Are you consecrated, or you're not baptized Methodist? How does that go? I don't know either. Well, you're Methodist. So they found God in the Methodist church. And then, given the antebellum era, we're talking about early 1900s, late 1880, 1890, 1901, what have you, found that, as we know now historically, that there was no equality in the Methodist church, in many churches, right? So they could not necessarily gather. If they were in this room at that era, they'd be sitting in a balcony or maybe in the room beyond the divider there, because there was not equality. And so over the decades, Richard Allen decided that this was not of God. This is not God's will for us to be separated even inside the house of faith. And so Richard Allen formed what is known today as the African Methodist Episcopal Church. He is the founder of it. He and Reverend Absalom Jones, and together alongside a number of peers and cohorts and other preachers, but these are just a few who came along during the antebellum era, who really sought out to lift up liberation theology, a quote-unquote social gospel, alongside the gospel that we all know, love, and preach, but seeking in the gospel of Christ this wonderful understanding, as taught in Luke 4, the Spirit of the Lord is upon us to seek freedom for prisoners, recovery of sight to the blind, and setting the oppressed free. All right. Other questions, anybody, before I move on? Yeah, Ian.
Let me give you the mic.
Uh-oh. I feel like I should know this, but so at this stage, are they preaching in all black churches that are separated? And so in that, so how free are they to preach the way they want? They feel
That's
safe in that space?
That's a fantastic question, right? I'm so glad you asked that. So, what I was alluded to earlier, an example to answer your question there, Ian, would be Mother Bethel AME. So, Mother Bethel AME, right, was very much under threat, because of their direct connection with what they, what we call today liberation theology, but without a title, just the idea that they were preaching the gospel in ways that were liberating people's hearts, souls, and minds, and teaching people that we're all made in the image of God, which was in direct contradiction to this sort of plantation religion that was still present. And so Mother Bethel AME was actually burned to the ground twice in the early 1900s, 2 times, right? Because time and time again, Denmark Vesey would present himself in the public, whether it was a state capitol, denominational gatherings, and very loudly protest the unequal and separate treatment between African Americans and others. And so absolutely, wonderful question. And a part of the very reason that those laws existed, right? So for many years in the South, as I shared earlier, you couldn't necessarily it was against the law. So where I went to seminary in Richmond, research we found suggests that it was against the law to be led by an African-American pastor until roughly like 1909. And so between 1865 and emancipation, you chart out 40, 50 years, African-American churches had to have a Euro-American pastor. That was the law. Mm-hmm. So to your point, right, these men and the women I talked about earlier were literally taking their lives in their hands. Yeah, this wasn't like I'm driving to church on Sunday to worship. No, wonderful question. Other questions, anybody? Yeah, Dr. Newton.
I used the mic, huh? Richard Allen, Philadelphia.
Yeah.
So I wanted to get it confused with Mother Bethel in South Carolina and the AME church that he started in Philadelphia. But can you tell us a little bit more about Denmark Vesey and his wasn't he lynched for
Was he
lynched? Wasn't he caught for a rally or revolt?
Yeah, Denmark Vesey was killed. I don't know all the ins and outs of the history of Denmark Vesey, but to the point that Pastor Ian's made, that Denmark Vesey was he was under threat, and he was killed, absolutely. So, and yes, these are 2 separate churches, right? Richard Allen formed the AME Church in Philadelphia, but Denmark Vesey was a part of that same movement, however, in South Carolina. But to your point, yeah, Denmark Vesey was among those who was under threat. He and Hiram Revels were in slightly different eras, obviously, because Hiram Revels became a U.S. Senator, whereas Denmark Vesey. So Denmark Vesey and the Bethel AME Church not only preached liberation, but they were a part of actual movements in South Carolina, let me check my time here. All right. So, as we have learned in recent years, right, long after emancipation, what would happen is you could easily find yourself back into a form of enslavement. You may not have been a quote-unquote formal enslaved African. However, here's what I learned. I did some genealogy research last year. Here's what I learned. So at emancipation, just to answer your question, Dr. Newton, you took me down this trail, so you have to own this. At emancipation, you were quote-unquote freed. In the county where my father's family is from, you had immediately then to go and pay taxes. Well, where'd you get the money to pay taxes? Didn't have that, right? So you had a couple of choices in that county. You could lease yourself out to a blacksmith, silversmith, or I don't know, a shoemaker, and that money you made would go first to the shoemaker, the blacksmith, or the silversmith, or whoever, and then whatever you had left, you could use to pay your taxes. Well, how would you eat? How'd you have a place to live? How'd you take care of your family? Well, you probably couldn't do all that, so back to slavery you go. So Denmark Vesey and the Bethel AME Church finding about similar things in South Carolina would stand and protest against it. They would go to the State House and advocate. They would go before, legislative bodies and speak against it. And over time, people say, well, this guy's causing trouble. And so, yeah, the church was burned down twice. Absolutely. And I think the span of time is not more than 10 or 15 years it was burned down, and eventually Denmark Vesey was killed. Yeah, and I don't know the details of his demise, but absolutely, yeah, he didn't just, die a peaceful death. No, that's not what happened. Yeah. So I hope that answers your question in part.
Oh,
What's that?
Denmark Vesey led a slave revolt.
Yeah, yes, he did. Yes, he did. And there are a number of folks. Denmark Vesey, John Brown, that's a long list. But yes, sir, thank you. Other questions, anybody? All right. So that takes me to, I kind of did this a little bit backwards, so forgive me, but I wanted to kind of sort of lay a groundwork for kind of the theological framework of African American preaching. And now I want to just share sort of a similar framework, if you will, for the kind of, I would say the style, if you will, of African American preaching, or the kind of the heart, in a sense, of African American preaching. Now, these links aren't live, so I'm just going to have to tab out here to my browser. 1 second. All right. Okay. So, here we go. So this song is an example of what we call and response singing. And so I'm going to play this here and see if we can get my volume up. Okay. All right. So I shared that for the purpose of laying out this understanding of call and response in African American preaching. Oh, I'm going to get back to my... All right. That the concept there is that African American preaching stylistically evolves from the continent, right? Where the whole idea of preaching was built on call and response. It was a dialogue in the sense that, as you heard those school children singing, what you heard was a lead, sort of, as we call it, lining the hymn, and everyone else responding. I don't know if that went well this morning or not, Clover, lead line. But anyhow, so you'd have this sort of the call, if you will, sort of the preacher, he or she would offer whatever was the thesis of their message for the morning or the moment or the evening, as it were, and the congregation, formal and informal, would respond. Now, that response today might be an amen. Back then, it might have been a chant. It might have been a call. It might have been a shout. But at either rate, it was a definite, intentional dialogue. That dialogue originates from the African drum. The drums were once played in every facet of African culture. They were and still are used for communication in African communities, to send messages over long distances. The drum beats contain set series of beats used as phrases, and listeners who know the codes and languages recognize the phrases. And so African history tells us that across villages and between communities, often signals were sent by the drum. And so as a result, that drum beat is, and continues to be more than simply a musical instrument, but it was a mode of communication. And so it took shape and life in the preaching on the African continent. And so as we come to this continent and began preaching in the hush arbors, then to antebellum slave period, and then post that antebellum period, when you hear the cadence, if you will, of African American preaching, in part what you are hearing is that drum beat. You're hearing this sort of essential character of call and response, that I usher something out, I utter something out, and the congregation responds. Now, if we're not careful, it can simply become style. But at its heart, it really is a part of our heritage. It's a part of who we are. It's a part of our communication mechanism of connecting, of saying, preacher says, I don't know, God is good. Yeah, all the time, right? So there's this sort of call and response that connects preacher and congregation, speaker and listener with the intention of being connected together in the Holy Spirit to God. And so that was the purpose of the drum, that it was a connectional tool, a mechanism to bring people together, to communicate and to develop oneness together. And so a great example of that, there are many. There we go. Would be one, jazz music, right? And so this is a clip. So what you hear is you hear what are actually two drums. And there's obviously some saxophone and some other stuff. But you hear a drum sort of sending out a steady call. And then you hear another drum, which is in essence responding. And then you hear piano come in. And so together, they are really in communication, which is we know what jazz music is a lot about. However, this particular piece, so you hear that kind of steady, and so everything else is in response to that. So it, in essence, is illustrating this call and response. Now, from that, we go to African American preaching, and the late Bishop G.E. Patterson, he was the president of the Church of God in Christ denomination. Oh, wow, you can't see it. So you hear that call and response, right? This sort of engagement with the listener is more than a style, but it is literally a part of sort of inherent in people of African descent. It is a communication mechanism. It's a rhythm. It's almost a heartbeat. And when it's missing, you can feel it. I'll just say that. And so there's a genuine uniqueness that connects in African American preaching between preacher and listener that is a rhythmic and spiritual exercise. I would more call it discipline. I don't know if that's the right word, but I think so. Yeah, that sort of intertwines preacher and the listener in such a way that without a doubt you are certain that God has engaged the two in that moment. All right, I'll pause there. Questions, anybody?
Not necessarily a question, but just more of a comment that is similar with MCs. I'm sure not everybody in here listens to rap, but in my hip hop and rap class, we learned a lot about this, about the origins of the MC and DJs and the call and response, and then listening to certain rap songs and the ways and the phrases that they were communicating that a lot of Euro Americans didn't understand the origins and the phrases that they were saying, and yet for African Americans was different, which I thought was really interesting to connect to preaching being similar. I definitely think music is a really great example. You could go all the way back to the Harlem Renaissance era, 1920s, right? If you listen to some of that Harlem era swing music, you can certainly hear a very bold call and response, right? You can hear it. Cab Calloway, if you ever heard a Cab Calloway song, I mean, it's clearly an entire orchestra is doing call and response. And so there is that, absolutely, that sort of thread that runs through. Other questions, anyone?
James Brown did it in his music as well.
James Brown. Bold example, but James Brown, yeah. Other questions, anyone? All right. And so from that, sort of foundation, if you will, we can take a look at sort of what I would call, I guess, mid-19th century to this new millennium, if you will, in terms of African American preaching, and some of those who are and were really pioneering and pillars of this sacred art, as you have so titled it. First, I begin with late Dr. Prethia Hall, who was a womanist theologian and a preacher. And Prethia Hall, probably the earlier part of that mid-19th century, but certainly a great legacy in preaching. Prethia Hall had impact on Dr. King, as did Gardner C. Taylor, once known as the Dean of American Preaching. Gardner C. Taylor and Prethia Hall, both extraordinary theologians in their own right, and Gardner C. Taylor, one of the most effective preachers of the Christian gospel that there ever was. Gardner Taylor pastored the Concord Baptist Church in Brooklyn, New York, and at that time he was among Harry Emerson Fosdick and Buttrick and others who literally had their sermons broadcast by NBC on Sunday night. Can you imagine that, Ian? I mean, can you imagine as a preacher, Clover, going home and turning on NBC and hearing your morning sermon? I mean, it's just extraordinary. Yeah, but Gardner Taylor's sermons were played on NBC. NBC radio, no less, but still NBC. And so so as a result, not just his wide appeal, but Gardner Taylor, as we talk about the sacred art of African American preaching, was what's called sort of a cross-cultural preacher. So it certainly carried the call and response sort of history and heritage. However, Gardner Taylor had an extraordinary capacity for speaking, preaching, communicating the gospel in any setting. And so he preached in just about every denomination, on every continent, in literature, on audio tape, video, conferences, I mean, you name it. And there's a wonderful book out right now, actually, about his preaching style called Cross-Cultural Preaching. I forget the author's name. I just started reading it about a month ago. But phenomenal preacher, extraordinary communicator of the gospel, and just historical grounding and foundation. Gardner Taylor is from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, very much steeped in African tradition, and yet extraordinary capacity to take these foundations we talked about today and really shape them in ways that could impact a listener of the gospel anywhere he went. Vashti McKenzie, very similar. First African-American female bishop in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and has preached all over the world, and very certainly has had the opportunity to hear Bishop McKenzie preach in the church I pastor in Pittsburgh, but carries very much the sacred tradition, the sacred art, if you will, of African-American preaching. And definitely Dr. Charles Edward Booth. Charles Booth was out of Columbus, Ohio, as a pastor, and preached all over the country and all over the world. And more than that, was a homiletics professor, and very much carried just an extraordinary capacity for this sacred art that we're speaking about today. One other would be Dr. Ralph West. And again, these are just a few folks there, a long list. But a few folks I pulled out that I thought really sort of stood large in carrying forth this tradition. Dr. Ralph West is one of them, from Houston, Texas. Charles Booth, as I shared, Columbus, Ohio. Gardner Taylor, New York City. Prethia Hall, more of an academician. And Ralph West, Houston, Texas, extraordinary ministry there, and was recently named by Baylor University as one of the 12 most effective preachers of the gospel ever. Which I don't know how you get to that list, but he's on it. So, I mean, how do you shape that list, Clover? You know what I mean? What you like look at my favorite preacher? I don't know. But yeah, Ralph West was named to that list alongside a cadre of other preachers. But point being, carrying that tradition of not only call and response, but as we talked about today, liberation preaching, social gospel, liberation theology. And I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about, for just a quick second, I'll take 2 minutes at most, the idea that that to the question Malcolm raised, to the point Ian made earlier, and my sister asked over here, that this dichotomy between the gospel of Jesus Christ that we all know and love and what was being taught on plantations and even after emancipation, even through antebellum, far over into, pre-Civil War and post-Civil War years, the idea was that as an African American, you had to find a way to get to truth, right? You had to almost question every source of information. And so the Christian preacher in the African American community became responsible not only for an effective sermon, but he or she also had to communicate a gospel that spoke truth to one's life. And so as a result, these preachers and those on whose shoulders they stand carried with them, as we call this, the sacred art of African American preaching, not just to preach an effective sermon, but therein, and I think Dr. Martin Luther King is a great example, therein also to speak to the daily life experience in the African American community. So yeah, preacher, so tell me, this great gospel, how does it save me when I get out of here today, How's it going to help my children in a segregated school, et cetera, et cetera. So when you talk about the sacred art of African American preaching, I think it is without question that the social gospel and the every other facet of the gospel are intertwined. And these are some of those who carried that well. And you all know Dr. Teresa Fire Brown. I've heard her here. And certainly I know you're familiar with her extraordinary capacity. And she's teaching now at Emory University in Atlanta. And so you sort of have in these preachers, and as I've shared many others, this continuance, this thread. Dr. Booth has since passed, Prathia Hall has gone on, Dr. Taylor has gone on, but you have this thread that runs through from the Hush Arbors in through the 19th century, now into the millennium of carrying the social gospel, carrying this call and response heritage, and carrying this connection to Christ as a liberator, as well as the Savior who saved our souls. All right. I will wrap there to give you all some time to raise any other questions you have or thoughts or feedback, reflections, ideas, comments. Love to share that. Yes, sir.
Yes. Is that Bill? Is that Bill? Bill, you have such a soft voice.
Yeah, it's just interesting to me in your whole talk, from the very beginning, the first preachers were women.
Yeah.
The social gospel was mentioned. And black preachers, what a target for white nationalism, right? This is an important year.
Yes, it is.
And I know you mentioned politics. I'm not asking you to get off on that, but this tri-target is so amazing, and so thank you for sharing. It's been
absolutely thank you. Yeah, very important year. Very important year, and preaching is challenged, as we know, in times like these. Yeah, Jim.
Yeah, Dr. Downing. The one thing I take away from what you've shared and my own experiences in my ministry work is thank you for keeping the faith.
Oh, thank you for that.
Yeah,
appreciate
amen.
that. Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Eugene, I want to ask you a personal question.
Yeah.
You kind of ended with the level of expectation on the sermon in the black church seems really high to hit political levels, personal levels. Right? There's a lot expected.
Yeah.
What's that like for you? How do you deal with that?
That's a great question, Ian. I think, it's demanding, and I think to the point made here that it's more demanding in moments like these, right? When we know that our world is, like going crazy. There are wars in 4 different parts of the globe, and there's You know, there's a Supreme Court judge who took a house for his mom. You've got these moments where community is expecting, call and response to contain the context of what they're going through. How does the gospel speak to what I'm experiencing, Pastor? So it's demanding. Yeah, it can be overwhelming, and I think that a couple of things. One, it underscores a critical need for clergy connection, to be able to process some of those things, to be able to sort of hear the experiences of fellow clergy and how they're making it through. And then also to be able to take care of oneself, to really, whatever you do, walk, run, bike, build boats, whatever you do, that it's really critical to be able to find outlets and to have strong family. Some days I come home, my wife is like, "Oh, is you just going to be silent for the next hour here?" I'm like, because you're processing all of these things. And Ian, to your point there, you are responsible for more than the gospel. So then decompressing your sermon begins with, was I honest with the text? Was I, authentic to the Spirit's movement? And then you wind up at, okay, now what did I say about the election? And what was I talking about over here? And how did this match over there? And you find that week in and week out that people are expecting that. And I think the expectation is sincere. I think, at times it's unrealistic, but and many times it's sincere when you think about, if we just think for a moment back to 2020 and 21, when young black men were being shot by police officers, coming to church had a different sort of expectation, that people were looking for some resolve, some solace, some comfort. How do we get through this, Pastor? We hear what you're saying. We know Luke 4, okay? But what does Luke 4 have to do with what happened out there? And so, it definitely comes with a nuanced expectation that is certainly a weight on the preacher. No doubt about that. Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. Yes, sir.
Is this the last question?
Okay.
He has to get to his other church.
Oh, I hope it's not the last question. I'm interested in your observations about what relationship, if any, there is between white evangelicals and black evangelicals in the current environment.
Not much. I mean, I think it goes to the point my brother here made that, we've seen the gospel compromised, and we've all seen it, right? I mean, it's not a secret. We have seen that happening, and we've seen white nationalism rise at the same time. We've also seen, though, right? So in my opinion, it's my opinion, so I can say it. In my opinion, white evangelicals are not just creating catastrophic challenges for people of color, but in my opinion, they're challenging freedom, period. Like, what I mean? When you look at an evangelical congregation, you don't see a woman's face anywhere in leadership. To me, that's a problem. It's as if you're saying to me that God didn't make everybody the same. I got a problem with that. That is not Christian, right? And so, but to answer your question, I don't know that black evangelicals is a thing. However, there are some who have subscribed to the evangelical movement. I don't know how they get along, sir. I do not. I don't, because it seems to me to be an extraordinary contradiction, So to answer your question, I don't know that African American preaching and white evangelical preaching in any way connect. However, we do know that there are African American pastors in the Southern Baptist Convention, for instance. There are some. And how they maintain their relationship, I'm not quite sure. But I do know for certain that, as we've talked about today kind of around the room, that in this moment, I really believe the Christian church has got to be thoughtful and prayerful, that we really have to, as pastors, preachers, lay leaders, lay persons, members of congregations, and whatever sort, to be thoughtful about how we live out our faith, and as we consider these stories that I've talked about today, Moses crossing the Red Sea from a real Pharaoh, and there's a Pharaoh now, and the idea of liberating the oppressed and setting captives free is now again under threat. And the fact that as Christians, we serve a God who would have us to see this in a more righteous way. So I just think we got to be really thoughtful and careful in these months ahead, this upcoming election, and everything that comes out of it, right? No matter how the election turns out, there's going to be some craziness, and it's just crazy. And so I just think we've got to stick together as a faith, black church, white church, yellow, brown. What Bishop Phillips, I understand, is coming next week. He's going to tell you about polka dot and pinstripe. Yeah. Every person there is, we've got to come together in our faith and realize that this is a time to unite our hearts one with another, and prayerfully, prayerfully others, whether they're white evangelicals or whatever the case may be, will begin seeing the gospel as it was meant to be shared. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
I want to help out with that question a little bit, because I was considered at one time a black evangelical. I went to Dallas Seminary, Philadelphia College of Bible. I taught at Moody, and I was ordained through Dr. Tony Evans, who's one of the leading black evangelicals today in this country. I hung out with Jerry Falwell, Chuck Swindoll, and those kind of guys. And yes, it is definitely a contradiction of faith and lifestyles. When you have a school like Denver Seminary or Dallas that teaches against Mormonism, they teach against Latter-day Saints as a cult, but yet the evangelicals were willing to elect Mitt Romney into the presidency and not Barack Obama, who was a converted Christian at Trinity Church in Chicago. And the same thing with the Donald Trump thing. Evangelicals has endorsed him as being a Christian, first of all, and being an evangelical second. When you look at his lifestyle, the evangelicals continue to preach about the lifestyle. That's part of the whole faith, the walk. But when you have a person like Donald Trump who's claiming to be an evangelical Christian, there's a problem with that. So I just want to say that to you. I was deep in evangelicalism coming out of Dallas Seminary. I had to go to the garbage can, open it up, and dump all that evangelical stuff in the garbage can. I used to be a white evangelical, but I know who I am now. Let's give Dr. Downey a hand and thank him for his time, his knowledge, his energy. We're so happy that you are here. Thank you so much. You've enlightened us. You have. You really have. Thank you. Thank you all for being here. We look forward to you coming again next week to hear our neighbor pastor, Valerie Jackson, Pastor Dr. Valerie Jackson at Park Hill United Methodist across the street. She will be here next Sunday at 9:30. Pastor, did you want to say anything? Pastor Ian, you want to say anything? Okay, thank you.